In this lecture, we'll talk further about key terms in pragmatics. I'll begin with folk pragmatics. What do we understand by folk pragmatics? Folk pragmatics usually consist of certain pre-theoretical beliefs, ideas, and expectations about the communication and use of language, any particular language. So we might have folk pragmatics about every different language. This idea of folk pragmatics actually comes from folk physics, where we have some pre-theoretical ideas and expectations about various concepts or elements of physics. For example, we have certain socio-cultural and folk expectations and ideas about heat, light, and based on that, we might develop certain theories of physics, and which may later on be tested on scientific lines. But we do have certain folk knowledge about various ideas, about various concepts in all fields of knowledge. Similarly, we might have certain, and we do have certain ideas about our communication and the use of language, which help us to define folk pragmatics. It is also inspired by folk psychology, in which we talk about the relationship between theoretical expectations and the behaviors and thoughts of people. One source of evidence about folk beliefs is how we talk about the domain in question, about a certain domain. For example, how we talk about communication or our talk, we have certain words in order to talk about certain things. For example, in terms of communication, we have the words like topic, say, mean, and we use expressions like did you mean that. So we have certain folk idea about these terminologies and these expressions. So how we use a certain thing in language, or how we say a certain function in language, we do have certain folk background about it. The vocabulary available for talking about communication differs somewhat from language to language. Various languages would have various words or expressions to say that. For example, positive feedback to a partner in communication is something which is universal. In all languages, and the speakers of all languages, when they are in a communication, they do provide positive feedback. But how it is provided may vary from culture to culture. For example, you might use various encouraging noises or some sort of short words like etc. But in English, you might say okay kind of words. But how they are said and what those words are may does vary from culture to culture. A systematic investigation into in such folk knowledge sometimes begin with folk words and transforms them into technical knowledge. This is what happened with folk physics also. The general concepts about light, about heat, they were first talked about in common terms, and then later on they developed into important technical terms of physics, which had a clear-cut definition, and in the process they might have gone to certain reformation or clarification. Similarly, in pragmatics, which is relatively a new science, we are in the process of developing more technical terms from these folk terms, and Grice has a major role to play. For example, he sees what is said in a favored sense. So he has tried to define the various phenomena into a certain acceptable terms or certain acceptable standards which may be applied to mark our language. He has developed certain maxims of communication through which we can understand or we could analyze our conversation. And these maxims are derived from our folk knowledge of communication. It is possible that the dominant folk theory of communication is the core model, and if so, Grice's work makes a considerable break from folk pragmatics. So, Grice has tried to develop some scientific or scientifically testable knowledge from our folk knowledge about communication. So we could say that Grice has helped us to uh, further move further and in an advanced way from folk pragmatics.